part of the reality, unfortunately, is having to deal with how we're going to still have our individual paths while living in systemic injustice and chaos. That's part of the gig. Not everybody suffers the impacts of it to the same degrees. That's totally true. And we're all still in this thing. So even if it's 5 or 10 minutes, the thing about this practice that's interesting is there's no magic technologies needed. It's as mundane and as kind of day to day as it comes, actually.
Hello, everyone. It's Irene Lyon here, and welcome to this long form interview with my good friend and mentor, Chris Dierkes. He and I have had two conversations prior to this one. I'm just going to give a little background because I do recommend going back to them if you haven't already listened and watched. They lead beautifully into today's conversation. So, the first conversation we had, I think it was back in 2017, was all on meditation and mindfulness and the basics of those practices. Chris comes from a background as a priest and also a monk, so he has a lot of experience with the worlds of meditation and mindfulness and using it for good as opposed to using it when we might not be ready for it or using it too much. So be sure to check that one out. Our second conversation happened last year in the summer of 2020. And in that one, we talk a bit more about the soul and healing a hurt soul and also finding sovereignty. We get deeper into his origin story and how he went through the path he did to end up where he is today, doing his work with an area called the crystalline consciousness technique. And while we don't get into this specific line of work he's doing now, I will link his information near this video, near this chat, so you can learn more about it if you are intrigued. Today, we get into a deeper discussion around being sovereign. We talk about the rise in interest towards plant medicines and various psychedelics to heal trauma. We speak to why there can be danger in that area when we're not ready and when we're not grounded and really solid in our biology and nervous system. We talk about social media and the conditioning that's occurring around that. We talk about the rise of tech and stress and people being in their own world of chaos and just this world that is quite chaotic. We talk about ancestral guilt. We talk about not making people dependent on us as leaders, healers, teachers. It's a great conversation that goes in many directions. We even talk about some old saints back in the day who really found the importance in coming back to the body and ourselves for answers. So without further ado, enjoy this meandering conversation with Chris Dierkes. Wanted to do a part 3 continuation of our discussions. It started back in 2017 was our first talk on meditation and mindfulness. And I looked and there's still a lot of people that are commenting and enjoying that episode. And then last year we chatted about the soul and sovereignty. That also has had lots of views. And so I wanted to do a part 3 and get into a few things. But as in our typical form, we had some email exchanges back and forth. So I'm going to read one of the emails verbatim, one of the earlier ones, which is an area that you thought would be interesting for us to tap into. So I'm just going to bear with me here. So you wrote a topic that we started to touch into a bit in the last interview, but could really be its own episode, would be how somatic regulation practices are really necessary when it comes to altered states, high strange encounters, mystical type phenomena. Also, in our meditation interview, we went into this, but only really in the context of mindfulness. And so you thought it'd be fun, good to bring in things like plant medicine, breath work, energy processes, more psychedelic tools that are really becoming popular, like microdosing with psilocybin, for example, ayahuasca,
And I actually did a talk about a month and a half ago on healing. I called it Healing Gone Bad.
Mhm.
So we'll link that, because my team and I do get emails and comments from people who have done things like this, and it's
Right.
completely broken them open to the point where they're bedridden
Mhm.
and not able to get out. Not to say that these can't be used, but so, you know, let's riff on that before we get into some more 5th century stuff.
Sure.
But yeah, like,
as is my want, sure.
yeah, yeah. Like what's happening there? I mean, I know from the nervous system perspective why it's so important to have these somatic pieces on board, but from your sweet expertise and what you've seen, like what are you seeing now? What do you just want to riff on with this?
Yeah, thanks. No, I think it's a really rich topic. Yeah, I think any of those processes, we could name a whole bunch of others. Those are just some examples, particularly things, as you said, that are gaining in popularity. So it's not like picking on any specific group particularly. It's more just kind of what's in the zeitgeist or whatever. But I think people are coming to a lot of these practices, and I certainly did, not the psychedelic side, but certainly I came more from the meditation side in my 20s, as we talked about in the previous recording. But if we don't know who we are first, and we don't know how to stay centered in our own experience as a physical human being in human form here, then we're kind of at the mercy, in my experience, of wherever these things might take us. Whether it's, and again, something like a plant medicine or something that has psychedelic or entheogenic properties, that's just like cranking the volume up. It's if you're doing a nice like counting your breaths meditation, you can only hit so many layers with something that's a little, I don't want to say it's lighter, but it's more, it's not cranking the dial up right away, for sure. Some of those other processes that are getting popular are really amping up the intensity quickly. And then the stuff that you may or may not be ready for is going to surface. So all of these processes are built out of traditions that don't necessarily have an understanding of what, like at least a contemporary understanding of how we would reference somatics and trauma work. So consequently, people may go on a ceremony and then all of a sudden something is kind of unleashed from the depths like a kraken that they're not. Do they have the stabilization? Do they have the support structures in their life after this kind of ceremony experience is over? They're going to go back to their relationships, their family, their jobs, the day-to-day of whatever their day-to-day rhythm of experience is. And they can really have this kind of haunting type experience if something came from the depths and they're not sure how to integrate it. This gets more complicated when those things that come out of the depths, kind of along the lines of what we talked about last time, from an energy point of view, may or may not be part of one's dharma, may or may not be part of one's path or work at a soul level.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. So let's say someone is carrying a sense of deep sort of ancestral guilt, maybe that's in the ancestral line. And they maybe on some, call it energy level or soul level or whatever we want to call it, feel kind of responsible for an ancestor. Maybe the ancestor did something pretty brutal to somebody. One could experience, if there is that in one's kind of, let's call it ancestral field, a person could experience something that's a pretty gnarly shadow, some kind of a sense of the energetic harm, perhaps, that was committed by an ancestor and feel deeply personally like guilty, shameful, responsible, and feel like it's somehow their work to clean up or be responsible for something that wasn't actually their doing.
Mm-hmm.
This gets dicey, particularly in the present climate. But but from an energy point of view, that might not actually be their work.
Mm.
They might have a responsibility, like we all do, to create a better reality in the present and moving forward, and to acknowledge the past wrongs and seek to break those cycles. But in actual practice, a person could be really rocked to their core by something that actually isn't theirs to be carrying. And that
That's
makes
really,
it tricky.
yeah. So
Does
I
that
want
make sense what I'm saying?
It does, and I want to ask a question and then go more into that. How would one know? And I think this is going to tie into what we spoke about last year in 2020 around sovereignty. But how would one know if they are falling down the path of healing stuff that maybe they shouldn't meddle with? If that makes sense.
It does. Or maybe like how to determine if stuff is arising, if it's really quote unquote ours or
Ours.
Not ours, for lack of
Yeah.
more sophisticated categories.
Yeah, and I guess it's tough because there is this element, as you said, right now in the current climate, that we have to heal all these intergenerational, transgenerational wounds. And then, you could just get overwhelmed by all of that and completely lose focus on just the current moment and what you need for your immediate family system, etc. So, yeah, what would be a sign or signs of a person going down a path that isn't, as you said, their dharma?
Well, I mean, to kind of take a step back, that's
Yeah.
why first I would say we need to have regulation and sovereignty and clarify our own state. So that along the way, whether we're doing various kinds of intense processes that might bring up stuff in a more accelerated way, or whether it just at a certain point kind of comes up of its own accord, that we can actually know in ourself and have discernment in our own being, have contact with our own inner knowing, and then be able to use that as the discernment tool for, oh, now this thing is up. Okay, how do I want to relate to this? Is this, because there's a lot of different possibilities. We talked there about an ancestral one, but another version just on a personal level would be like something that comes up. Is it an old pattern to let go of? Or is it maybe a shadow form of ourselves that we've actually been repressing, that we actually need to like befriend and transform and make part of ourselves? Or is it some old dead skin that's really like false programming and a sense of I should have been like this, but it's actually a family script or cultural script or something that's just gotta, without a like an inner homing beacon, without that state of inner knowing first, it gets very convoluted and it can get very tricky very fast. Without first having one's own inner knowing, when all these things arise, how do we sift them? How do we categorize isn't the right word, but like have a frame of reference that's life-giving and helpful in terms of interpretation to be able to really clarify, like, oh, for example, no, this is a part of me that actually looks on the surface like it's some gnarly piece, but actually this is part of my innocence, or this is part of my glory, and I've pushed it away, and now it's been in the basement, and now when it makes its first appearance, it looks pretty rough, but actually there's some gold here. Or no, actually this is somebody who I've outgrown, or who I thought I was supposed to be, and I just need to say goodbye, versus here's a whole other thing that actually doesn't belong to me, but is a life that I've been living because I've been trying to fulfill my parents' unfulfilled lives that is actually their business and not mine. Or so these, and there's other categories we could name, in there, but those are some very foundational kind of buckets or categories to place these kinds of things that are arising. Because, in a lot of these processes that are popular nowadays, just like whatever arises, it's yours, and here's how you work on it, and just keep going through it in whatever way that level of subtle nuance and differentiation of like, wait, before we jump in and start responding to whatever's arising, like, what is the nature of this experience? How would I might examine or evaluate or assess it in a healthy way? And then have a strategic, wise, kind of discerning, discriminating intelligence based on what we might intuit that it is. This is the tricky part about sovereignty.
No kidding.
Yeah.
I mean, as you were talking there, there's almost a sense of, and I don't like this term, but I can't think of a better one, that humanity just needs to take a big time out.
Right. Take a breath, have a pause.
How, like, those movies where all of a sudden everyone freezes and they stop time.
Right.
Like, it just has to happen for like 2 years. So everyone can do their somatic regulation work, actually find out who they are, almost disconnect from some of the group think that's occurring. Because when you're not grounded in your sovereign state and in your biology, soul, whatever it is so easy to Velcro and stick to the next thing and the next thing. And I felt that pull, but I also have felt it doesn't happen very long. I catch myself like, no, that's not my thing. I don't want to go that route. And I mean, I'll speak freely about it. I've been kind of ridiculed and canceled almost because I didn't buy into the masses of everything that was going on in the past year. And it's like, no, like I've got enough to do with my daily life, the work I'm doing with my students, my creativity, my health. One more thing. That's kind of how I looked at it. But there was also a very strong aversion to jumping into everything that was happening. And I feel stronger because I didn't get lured in, if you will. So here's a question. If someone's listening to this and they're like, oh yeah, and it doesn't have to be the events of the past year, but any time, whether it's the clique that you joined in university, you went on that joyride and you really didn't want to, and then someone got hurt, that we all have those stories where tragedy happens because we're following the leader. I mean, that happened in my high school. A very dear friend was killed because of, drunk driving and all these things. And in a situation like that, how do you not backpedal, but reconcile with maybe a decision? It's almost like, is it okay to change one's mind when we're in something? And how do you extricate from that? Am I making sense?
I think so. I think it goes back to, do we have a felt sense in our own body of what our real knowing is? And are we willing to listen to that? How many stories do you have, or do I have, of working with folks where they the story starts off, I met this person, the first time I met them, I had a spidey senses were tingling, but then I was like, oh, but I should be loving, and I don't know.
There's so much potential.
And then that story doesn't usually end well in whatever form. And it's like, well, your spidey senses were tingling. Some part of you knew something's off here. That's one example. Or in that kind of example you're sharing of a group feeling like something's not adding up here, that funky feeling. To learn to trust our BS detector, to learn to trust our spidey senses. If they're tingling, like, trust them. at least inquire into, well, that's interesting. Why did I have this response? Instead of just, yeah, whatever. That's just me making stuff up. That's just like, no, something came up. Why? Versus any of these kind of scenarios we're talking about, they have programs and they have systems already in place for better, worse, in between, good, bad, and ugly. But there's a system and they kind of roll with it, whatever the system might be, and however long the system and however much lineage it might have. It's gonna seek to, explicitly or implicitly, it's gonna seek to conform us to the system. Whatever that system is. Extremely hardcore Zen Buddhism. I was raised in hardcore Catholicism. I was in all kinds of entrained systems. So again, this isn't picking on like this group or that group, or it's like the whole thing, the whole shebang, the whole enchilada here, like across the board. So I think a lot of what's occurring in the present moment is those older systems are collapsing. They're being outstripped by the intensity and the speed of experience. And consequently, they're becoming very rigid and reactive. And kind of battening down the hatches, or in other cases, just kind of run around like a chicken with its head cut off. Just chaos and in total like freak out mode.
Totally. It's like one last act of intensity to try to do something.
Yeah, keep it going.
Hold the stake in the ground, Yeah. As I tune into that viscerally and bring my mind to the macro of the world, I'm like, yep, I think that's what's occurring right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of systemic chaos afoot. And that's where, again, we need to be able to come back home to ourselves and learn to trust our own knowing, to learn to trust our own ability to regulate, and then we need a lot of kind of nimble action in the present moment, because a lot of things are shaky and flipping out, and this week it's one thing and next week it's the next thing, and and it's this way and that way, and every, to get orientation, to get clarity, to have an ability to stay even keeled in the midst of everything else kind of being quite wobbly. We really have to do our inner work, and we really have to develop a kind of inner steel, inner kind of spine of steel, for sure.
I want to talk about that inner steel soon. I'm being very general here, but the person whom sees all the chaos and just chooses to shut it out and to completely disconnect to the point where they don't even know what's happening in the external world. And then there's the individual that's so immersed in it that it's impacting them viscerally, physically, it's their function.
Yeah.
And then my sense is there's maybe this Goldilocks situation where you're aware of some things, but not to the point where it's debilitating, but also not to the point where you're shutting down from what is occurring.
Right.
So how would you comment on those three spots? And it's really a spectrum is what I think, but would you say that those might fluctuate and shift in a person? Like, what would be the perfect situation if there's such
Well, I think one thing is to know first, as you mentioned earlier, like to be able to recognize more quickly if one is finding oneself more on one edge or another, and to recognize it and be able to go, whoops, I totally got pulled into something and I started losing myself and was getting activated, and it was like, go hang out with the trees and check out the sky and the waters and remind yourself of like the things that have durability and the things that have length and wisdom that are long beyond our current various kinds of complexities, let's call them. And we're noticing on the other hand, whoops, I'm kind of really finding myself like zoning out a lot.
Yeah.
And to become curious in either case, why is that happening?
Mhm.
Why am I zoning out?
Mhm.
And what am I avoiding?
Mhm.
What's there for me that I'm turning away from? And what does it look like to turn towards it? What
Mhm.
happens then?
Mhm.
And yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm a believer that we should be attuned and aware of the currents of things without as much as possible being do it in a way that's discerning, you know, whatever that is for each person. Like, you don't have to be caught up in the emotional volatility of every outrage on social media of the week, and then that you might not have any personal influence in, you might not have any personal ability to really affect much, but somehow it feels important to get emotionally all charged up as if that's actually helping anybody who's in a difficult situation. Obviously, it's not helping anybody that actually needs help. For people just to be constantly getting activated and then collapsing, how does that help people who need real help?
Yeah, the social media thing is interesting. I mean, you're not on social media anymore, are you? Do you even have a YouTube channel still?
There's some things that are up, but I haven't posted anything and
No,
done anything. It's
no.
yeah.
And yet you're
My
surviving.
life is
Fine.
full. My life is quite full.
Yes, yes.
As is. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really interesting one. I mean, do you think that there is a role? I believe there is, because I know my work gets out to people via social media.
Hmm.
What do you think from a macrocosm is happening in those social media worlds where there is this constant attack, collapse, but also massive things that are being taken out of context? You know, I almost am wishing I had 10 years to go back to university to learn things that are happening globally that I wish I had a better understanding of,
Hmm.
but I don't. And so I can't even make intelligent commentary on certain things because I don't know the history to the degree I wish I did. And that, I think, is a fascinating one. But from what you see, do you see a purpose with it?
I think people have to be very clear in their intentions of why they would be participating first. That would be, and I'm not here to say, hey, everybody leave, don't leave, whatever, right? Obviously, that's not my style, but just to say, going through the sort of default mode of how we've all been sort of conditioned around social media. So there's the famous statement by the great Canadian media communications godfather theorist Marshall Mcluhan,
Okay.
that the medium is the message, which people say a lot, but they don't really get what he was actually talking about, I don't think. Which is to say, when you look at the nature of the medium of communication, and he was particularly way ahead of his time on growing forms of technology.
Who was this again? I don't even know that name.
Oh,
Gee, I
Marshall.
need to go back to school.
Yeah, he's a great Canadian. Marshall Mcluhan,
Okay.
Mcluhan.
Okay.
He was sort of 60s, 70s. I think he died in the early mid 80s, maybe early 90s, but he's sort of the godfather who in some ways kind of predicted and saw way ahead, I think, in terms of the impacts of communication technology, the rise of like information systems. And his famous sort of pithy statement that most people misinterpret is the medium is the message.
I've heard
And
that.
what he was trying to say, I think really it's a much subtler point than I think most people sort of grasp, which is the structure of the medium of communication itself can structure the forms of communication and dialogue and relationship that tend to happen within those. Whereas most people think, oh, it's just a neutral slate. I just type in information, send a message to somebody, they type stuff back, we have a nice conversation. And they don't think about like, what is the format, what is the structure of social media, and how might it actually structure the entire way that we're relating in ways that can be very unconscious. For example, in the social media example, might it be structurally built to do various things like lessen your ability to maintain focus and attention on one critical topic and go in depth while feeling calm within oneself?
Yeah.
Might it activate, or might it be set up structurally to tend, not in every example, but often to tend towards a little bit this and this and this and over here and over that, and like kind of jittery, kind of energy, right? Like, or your YouTube algorithm does like, oh, you like this video, you should watch this video. Oh, you like this book, you should do that thing. So the structure and at play in those systems, and they're ever present in our world. So it's not like I'm saying like, you know, go live in a cabin in the woods and whatever. I don't do that, but I am selective, I am discerning. I had to find for myself what felt like the appropriate way versus like when I was like feeling like I had to respond to things, or I was getting like activated by stuff. It's like, wait a minute, this is all kind of in cyberspace is real space, but it's also sort of not real space. Like it's this weird hybrid virtual reality. And we're getting the emotionality, the research shows really deeply that the emotionality in those spaces increases. The volatility, the sense of acceleration is increasing people's. And as we know from things we talked about, and you're always talking on about, trauma is too fast, too furious, right? So these spaces do have a tendency, if we're not clear in our intent and clear in our somatic practice, even while being, you know, in this seemingly disembodied, but not really disembodied internet way, will tend to get swept in the current.
Yeah.
And the current is not, I would say, on this front, our friend.
No. I mean, I'm thinking about, I really appreciate that the medium is the message. And I remember listening to an interview, I think it was Jordan Peterson, and he was speaking about Twitter, for example, and what happens in that platform, on that platform, and how you only give people a certain amount of characters, and it's a little longer now.
Right.
What does that do to the human mind, thought, thinking, interaction when you can only express so much in such a succinct, like one might say, well, you're having to really formulate what you're trying to say in a small thing, but it also disallows any nuance and any context to be added to that, just like taking sound bites out of various things, and you only hear one piece of a long form interview.
Right.
And then you make assumptions based on that one soundbite, and then it gets attached to something else, and before you know, someone's life is destroyed.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Now, I remember last year, a colleague of mine, or I don't know if it was a colleague, something happened on, I think it was Instagram, where someone demanded a colleague of mine respond to them in a comment forum, like an open forum. And they were attacking this person. And I'm like, what? Like, why are you demanding that a stranger openly give their opinion in an open forum on a thread, and you're both trauma SE practitioners? This doesn't make sense.
Right.
And it kind of blew my mind open to like, wow, even those who have studied this work aren't seeing the damage that they're doing within these contexts. So very interesting. It's interesting. We get a lot of DMs, within, and I'm better at deleting them. Sorry, folks. But if you want to contact me,
you have to decide your boundaries. Everybody's got to decide. It's your house. If you're building an online home, let's call it, or an abode, just like your own home, you wouldn't just have people
come on in.
coming in, you welcome them in, or say, hey, like, I'm going to bed now. Like, this is not my time to come. You come just barging into my house here in the middle of the night. Yeah.
Yeah. I see them, but we don't respond. And if you want to get an answer, go through the site, go through my other feeds.
Yeah.
I wanted to, anything else on that concept of this ancestral guilt, and any further thoughts on, I want to dive into a few more things, but.
Yeah, to separate out, it's important to differentiate a sense of responsibility, which we all have as a collective, to heal the past and make a better present and create the possibilities for a different future, versus taking on a sense of debilitating shame and sort of poisonous, self-defeating collapse energy that leads to helplessness and freeze, which then takes somebody off the board of being a potential agent of change.
Yeah. Well put.
And that line is a lot finer, I think, than most people realize it is.
Well put. You also had said, back to the plant medicines, the intense breath work, the massive retreat that just rocks their world.
Right.
And you stated in another exchange, why do people want these altered states? And you said it could be for many reasons. Maybe that they're not happy with their current state, so they're looking for something different. Let's talk about that, these altered states. And just my sense, my hunch, and let's chat on this, is people want novelty. They want like an explosion of newness, just like falling in love, like this kind of, I want that hit, that chemical, because it feels so good. And God, it does feel really good. And yet that wears one out if that's all you're doing constantly. Yeah. So what do you think about this whole wanting an altered state? And what is?
Well, I mean, we've been doing it as a species for a long time. So this is, like people who point out, like, think of like, people who are into like electronic dance or like trance music scenes, right?
Yeah.
There's flashing lights, there's sort of thumping percussion, there's usually some substances going around, right? Not my scene, but that's how I've heard. If you look at it, if you just took it in a slightly different lens, people drumming around a campfire who might be taking various kinds of plants or alcoholic substances or various other kinds of substances that they've grown or synthesized, like that whole thing has been going on for, I don't know, 20, 30,000 years. That's not new. Like the little bit of the electronics of it is, but it's actually structurally the exact same form over and over again, with the lights, the percussion, dancing, strong physical movement, and then usually some kind of amplification of one's state through some kind of substance means. Yeah. That didn't start with Burning Man. They didn't invent that.
Not to that degree, no.
So, on the positive side, we could say, why do people seek those states? Because there are other possibilities of creativity. There are possibilities to get our head out of the fog of sort of the mundane that can tend to kind of get us reduced in our ability to see or feel or imagine other possibilities. That, I think, would be classically the positive value that's often sought. Unfortunately, there's often with that, however, whether it's realized or not, or spoken or not, or to whatever degree it's conscious or not, often also a feeling of, I want to get out of the present moment. And that's where it can get dicey. That's where the bypassing tendencies can come in. That's where it can be a thought that, whatever it is, falling in love, ecstasy, plant medicine, pick your thing. Like,
Yeah.
it's gonna it's gonna relieve me of the complexity and the beauty and the pain of being human, of this human life, right?
Mhm.
And those things are not going to do that, because it doesn't matter how long one can practice and how incredible a state one might achieve. And there are some really elevated, wild, ecstatic, beautiful states. I've been blessed to have many of them, but they end. They all end.
Yeah.
They all have a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah.
And the question is, what's the end? Like, how do you deal with the end? If one can consciously go into those just as a part of a creative, not from a feeling of deficiency, but from a feeling of wholeness, and then it's creative and exploratory, and then is totally fine with it, appreciate its cycle, and then when it's done, also appreciate like more quote unquote ordinary or mundane experience.
Yeah.
That's one thing.
Yeah.
But when there's a lot of unhealed wounding in our being, and then it's like altered states are gonna, I'm gonna pop out of this pain of my day-to-day life, and I'm gonna see the lights, and I'm gonna see the truth, and it's all love, and then it's gonna be great.
Mhm.
It's all great for that moment, but it's like, I often feel it's like, yeah, it's like Wile E. Coyote. It's like Wile E. Coyote, when he runs off the cliff, and then it's the moment where he's hanging in the air before he looks down, and then he plummets, right? Like, that's usually the plunge. Is usually, if that happens, is less pleasant, depending on the degree to which the height of that various kind of state might be.
Do you think that
I've had those experiences too, so I can speak from personal experience on that.
Yeah. Do you think that, when you mentioned, we've been doing this for 20, 30,000 years, it feels to me that that kind of rave ecstasy is a little different, just because the chemicals are so strong.
Right.
And
there might not be a context as there would have been. One part that could be very different is that it's part of a whole woven culture of life. And there are specific times where it's like, we're going to all go, blow our minds for a time, and then deal with the come down, and then all that kind of stuff. And that's actually kind of like part of the gig.
Mhm.
Whereas in a more sort of secular materialist context, which would otherwise be the default sort of cultural mode, it's just some kind of a way to try to, on an individual, it can be very isolating, like try to just get out of day-to-day pain, like the Monday to Friday grind, and like, here's the weekend, and let's kind of blitz our minds for a bit.
Yeah. I remember in my SE training, it was Steve Hoskinson who was my main trainer. I don't know if this was his original thought or something he had heard from one of his contemporaries, but and I wrote it down last night so I wouldn't forget, that when we started to medicalize birth, that euphoria of the bonding, the connection with the mother ended, was kind of ripped away. And it's more than just oxytocin, it's everything, that the touch, the feeling, the lights, and then you've got the safe thing person, that when that occurred, it coincided beautifully 20 years later with the rise of people doing LSD in the 60s. And I remember reading Michael Crichton's book, Travels. I don't know if you've read that book.
Yeah, I didn't read that one.
Oh my goodness, I quote it all the time, and I even did a video on one of the chapters where he speaks about being in medical school, because he was a medical doctor before he became a movie producer. Being in the hospital where where mothers gave birth in Boston in like the 1950s. And it was called the Boston Lying In Hospital. And he said it was like going into Dante's Inferno. He even said that in the book. And that you walk in and there's these 3 different wings, and all you hear is screaming in one area, and then the other area everyone's medicated. And then in another area they're medicated with something else. They don't remember what's happening.
Yeah.
but it was, and you'll appreciate this because of your Catholic background, it was, you know, Boston, you know, 1940s, 50s. The back room was all of the teenage moms that had gotten pregnant out of wedlock.
Yeah.
And they were literally dropped off by the parents. We'll come back to get her when she's birthed the baby and the baby's gone somewhere else. And they didn't give any of the medication, any of the painkillers to the young girls. But the young girls, he said, were the ones who were actually awake and connecting with their pregnancy experience. And he said it was just so backwards that they were being punished in this way, and yet they were actually having the real connection with their infants, with their babies.
Yeah.
And these other mothers that were very affluent, dressed up with the full makeup, hair, and perfume, felt nothing. They were given a drug that would make them forget. And to think how a human would come into the world without any connection from that mother, that I think is when Steve said the medicalization of birth started. Anyway, I thought that was interesting because if you never got that hit of this human being loves me and is connecting to me, would you spend your whole life seeking that altered state when really it is a state that brings us in to the world?
Yeah, that's powerful insight.
DMT comes to mind, right? Was it dimethyl?
Yeah, I mean, anything. I mean, those are more exterior substances that we might ingest that then really catalyze and are quite catalytic and can really fire the engines. But just as much if somebody's doing super hardcore yoga or intense, like I said, like 15-hour meditation a day or whatever, like you can do the extreme fasting, or people who are into all the, you know, like extreme sports, wilderness type stuff, you know, always about like fearlessness and courage, and a guy hanging off a rock, you know, poster in the corporate spaces in the 90s. Like anything can really turn into let's take this thing like all the way to regain something that was primordially lost, which is what you're talking about, rather than, oh, maybe I need to take a step back here and inquire into this moment instead of how do I like change my state and how do I do these crazy wild things, which are totally possible. You can go, you know, read all these wild stories of superhuman capacities of these yogis who live, you know, wherever, or intense fasting people. I mean, there's all kinds of beyond the ordinary capacities of the human body mind. I'm not denying those are real, but are those people happy? A lot of them. I don't know. If you look at some of those pictures of those ascetics, they look pretty grim. They look pretty serious. They look pretty angry and upset and all the rest. And I don't know. Like, so to me, it's always first, can we be settled? Can we be content? Can we be at ease and joyful, even while things are complicated or gray or ambivalent in this here, now, presently? If you then also want to try to develop certain capacities, stretch some limits, whether it's physical types or deeper layers of emotionality or relational capacity, like I'm always saying, like we want to grow from wholeness into greater degrees of wholeness and not start with, I'm broken, here's what's wrong. And then some magic formula or magic system is going to tell us. So all those schools are going to have some way of telling you, here's what's wrong with you. You're born in sin and you need to be redeemed. You're born unenlightened. You need to go through this whole big long thing to become an enlightened master. You're out of connection with the universal energies and the cosmic, whatever, get new agey. Like literally, it doesn't matter. It can be a traditional religious thing. It can be a personal growth thing. It can be a alternative spiritual thing, whatever. They're always going to have some version of, always look for, here's the problem. Here's what's wrong with you. We have the magic solution. Here's our X number of steps, magic formula to solve the problem of being you and human. And I'm always kind of saying, couldn't we start from a different foundation?
Mm-hmm.
That we're whole, and our wholeness and our sovereignty may not be fully manifest in a whole bunch of different dimensions of our life, and we want to become responsible for those and bring those back into wholeness. But could we really stop with this whole starting off with we're all flawed, broken beings? Couldn't we start off with our goodness?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm guilty of that, and how my company and the work I do, because and it's true. And what's it's irony. Here's some irony for you, because we do run things like Facebook ads and give money to the beast, right?
Right.
And when you're writing these ads, or when I've learned about them, you have to be very careful about the language, because they actually don't let you say that someone is broken, which is so strange, in my opinion, for other reasons, that they're keeping that clean. And so we've had to find ways to creatively say what this work is, because people do know that they're sick, that they have troubles, that they can't sleep, that their gut is completely a mess, that they are addicted to things. And so one would be like, well, I do have this problem and I need to get fixed.
Right.
And it's almost like there's this 180-degree shift that we have to make. And obviously this conversation is contributing to that shift of, okay, so you've got this XYZ problem, and yet you're here.
Yeah.
I say that often to the students who are with me that feel like there's no point, nothing is changing. And I'm like, well, you are here. Many aren't. So use that as a sounding board, a platform to realize that you're actually doing pretty darn good, considering all these other things that have occurred. But yeah, that is an interesting one.
It's a real paradox, for
How do
sure.
we fix it, Chris? Maybe there's nothing to be fixed.
Well, there's definitely work to be done, but I guess we're trying to say, like, how to go about it in a way that's empowering and life-giving, and that doesn't subtly reinforce and undermine the best intentions. So people being actually able to connect to their wholeness first, to me, is otherwise all that altered state stuff of whatever version always ends up as like the end point is the goal. Then you'll be okay. There's always an unspoken, sometimes it's explicit, but usually it's kind of implicit, and then you'll be okay. Your X flawed being, here's our magic system that we inherited from some beings from the 15th dimension or whatever, wherever they got her, some magical being from the woods somewhere, whatever, whoever, wherever it came up with. And we've now held it, for all these years, and now we're going to impart it to you, and then you'll be okay. That's always the ... And to me, that's the problem, because if we're not okay in some deep fundamental sense as a starting point to then turn towards the stuff that actually does need to be healed or cleared or created in our life, or let go of or surrendered, whatever. If we're not starting off from that place, we're not getting to that place by a path that continues to reinforce the message that we're not okay. And it's like the carrot, the rabbit's got on the turtle, and it's just going to keep going after it. And that carrot's just going to keep being right in front of its face. Like that's the lure, that's the dangle. And I think that's a problem. And I think it really takes people down a road until eventually they realize none of the practices, none of these exterior technologies, if you want to call them that, are going to rescue us. We're going to have to become our own medicine, fundamentally.
100%, as I say. And it's not to say that, and I think I want to be very clear, so there's no confusion.
Right.
This doesn't mean that you should not work with someone like you or someone like
Sure.
me or someone like a therapist.
Right.
It's the context by which you go into that work that is essential.
Is it an empowered context? Do you feel like I'm a whole being and I'm choosing to work with someone who has some skill to help me develop a similar skill to grow and deepen my wholeness? Or is it this person's going to rescue me, or this system's going to rescue me, or, that's where it gets disempowered and where it gets dicey right away. When there's something outside of ourselves, an expert, a system, or whatever, that's going to be our salvation. That's that
can I share something that often triggers me?
Yeah.
Tell everyone.
Sure.
Why not? So obviously lots of people follow my work and people do the things that I put out and all that. And what pings me in a wrong way, or it kind of goes, it makes me want to like just open up a restaurant and quit. Seriously, is when someone will say something along the lines of, and I'm generalizing, oh, Irene, we couldn't live without you. Please take care of yourself. I rarely talk when I'm tired or anything. And I recently posted a picture of just out for dinner with my husband, Seth, and just like, it's so good to have a day off and have a night off because it's been a lot of work the last few years, as you know. And so there was a genuine concern from someone. It's not a bad thing. Like, oh, please take care of yourself. We couldn't do this without you. And in those moments, I really listen, because I'm like, oh, no.
Yeah.
Like, I could die tomorrow and you will have to be okay. Right. And I know that's a little harsh, but yeah, it's it kind of goes, no. That's not why I'm here. I'm not here to make sure you're okay. And yet, yes, there's things I'm teaching that are helping you be okay.
Yeah. It's helping getting back in touch with the natural resilience.
Yeah.
And the native creativity and generativity of our being. That's who really does the yoga. That part of us is the one that really does the work. And that's a real point of maturation in a person's process, when they go from, okay, I'm going to study the system, work really hard, I'm going to be good, and I'm going to follow the rules, I'm going to do all the things. That's a phase, and maybe it's a phase we all have to go through. Yeah. It's better than just kind of effing off and not doing anything, and just like, well, whatever. And just like life just rocks you around, you just rocked on the boat. At least you're trying to, at that point, a person's at least trying to like follow a system, follow a path, find a way, develop some capacity in their life. But there's a certain point at which, like, it's such a weird paradox that you kind of like need the system at the front end, and then the system becomes the obstacle to the real work at a certain point. And that's a tricky juncture point.
It's hard.
It is hard, because it's comforting when there's something, for people who maybe their lives are in a period of extreme chaos, and they find something that actually does, like people who do 12 steps or, whatever, like, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, my life is getting like more organized. Like I feel more, it's not so chaotic and all over the board. And then at a certain point, it doesn't have to be that system, could be any system. Like eventually that system will reach its limitation. And then it's tricky, because it's like the fear is, oh my God, I'm going to go back to the original state of chaos. Or it's like, I just want to keep doing. The people who get stuck and stagnant, they're good at doing the system, but then they never evolve to, like, the system is now so a part of their being that it's their spontaneous artistry at that point. Like back in the days of like artists, or like the apprentice, master, they teach you, okay, here's how you do this, and here's how you cut the wood, and whatever the skill was. And then there was a period of being a journeyman.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
You know, you have to go and have your own practice of carpentry or whatever it was. And then to be a master is like the tools are no longer external to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
The tools are now simply an exterior mechanism for the artistry to do its thing. And that kind of spontaneous flip from it's like, okay, I'm following the system, I'm good at it, I'm getting adept, I'm getting skilled, to like the spontaneous mastery, and now the tools are the mechanism just to play, is really where I think we need to be moving.
I love what you just said, and I hope everyone really caught that, because one of the reasons why I have chosen, again, in my work, for example, to have a program that's only 12 weeks, and then it ends, and then people have to figure it out for the rest of the year, and then they can come back the next year and revisit, is I just could feel internally that it wasn't going to be of service to people for me to be there every single week, every single month. A, from an energetic point of view, that's not for me. But B, you're not going to master and figure it out and kick the can around, so to speak, in your own world and figure out how to do that without having that guidance all the time. Not to say that guidance isn't important at the outset, but to, as you said, create mastery within even just one little thing. It doesn't have to be mastery of everything. I think that might be a part also to clarify. Mastery doesn't mean you're done and you're not going to learn another thing that's going to throw you into chaos and uncertainty, right?
Yeah. I think it's the spontaneity that is exhibited in those moments. That's what's kind of masterful or elegant. And that's when the shift has taken place, when it feels like the thing is outside myself and I'm getting good at following it, to like, it's now so embedded, like it just becomes part of who we are. And you're right, that doesn't mean the end of the road. To me, that's actually when the whole thing begins. That's like the real beginning. That's when it gets fun. It doesn't get less wild, it gets more wild. So,
I agree. Well, it's like we call things a medical practice, a law practice. It's not medical perfection, medical mastery. It's the doctor is trained in a very controlled way. It's a lot of stuff, and then they go out and practice medicine, for example.
And find that it doesn't exactly conform to the extremely rigid 4 squares that they were
that they learned
put into. Yeah, exactly.
Totally. All right. I want to.
Just to say, like, just to tie that, the mastery piece to the altered states, like that's where a person isn't seeking altered states, but like actual transformation of one's being, which may or may not have periodically temporary altered states associated with it. That's fine if it happens, fine if it doesn't. But it's no longer, that's what the game is really about. The fundamental intention has radically shifted to staying present with what's experienced and having agility with whatever's arising. Versus I'm looking to get out of the current experience and to go on some other trip in order to go somewhere else where I think my problems will be solved. Only then to later find out that place has its own problems.
As well.
You may have just traded one set for another, and you may also crash back to the present, and it may even be tougher, having had experiences sometimes with places that feel less burdened than one's current reality.
100%.
Yeah.
It makes me think of, when I've taught group classes and workshops, I've always preferred it when we're not in a retreat setting. Like, and of course people come from other countries and cities, so they're not going home necessarily, but there is something about doing a workshop in just a general community center where people have to go out and find their own food and
Right.
navigate traffic and take care of themselves. Yeah, it's nice to go and have everything provided for you, but
Sure.
the shock factor going back into the real world is higher. And I often wonder if the learning doesn't iron into the system in the same way when there isn't that little, like at the end of each day, or even at lunch break,
Right.
you have to go find a sandwich somewhere.
Right.
Practice your skills as you're walking to the store and talking to the people and all those things. And there's an integration that occurs when you keep it really simple and not as fancy. So had that thought.
Cool.
I want to talk about, as we kind of wrap up, but this might bring us into another area. You were talking about a saint, Augustine, and 5th century. Apparently, he and I share the same birthday,
That was amazing. Yeah.
November 13th. You said, oh, a Scorpio, that makes total sense. I don't even know what Scorpio means. I should, but I don't. So
Lights and darks.
Say that again.
Lights and darks. The scorpion's venom can either be medicine or it can be poison.
Oh.
So Scorpios have a lovely capacity to play with the dynamic of, is in your case, trauma going to be poisonous, or is it actually going to be transmuted to become the source of life?
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Perfect. So apparently St. Augustine, I'm just reading from your email, referred to the self as curved in on itself. Mm-hmm. The Latin would be, I'm going to have you say it.
Incurvatus se. Yeah.
Incurvatus se, like a snake coiled in on its own tail.
Yeah.
And this concept of, speak to that a little bit. This curved in on itself. And the other word that you used was self-contraction, if you can recall.
Yeah. So Augustine, quite a character, but he basically invented, I think most people would say, quite sort of, I guess you'd say invented the autobiography. He's generally considered like creating the first like memoir autobiography, famously known as the Confession. So it's not every day I invented the autobiography genre. That's pretty, put that in your cap. So Augustine was this classic spiritual seeker, and the Confessions is his great detailing of he tried out this system in his day, he tried out that system. He was a very dedicated student, very bright student, and would get into things and then go all in, and then find out how it was flawed by the time he got all the way through it, and then realized, oh, this still has left me hungering. There's still some kind of ache or restlessness in my being. And then he would try another system. Okay, this one's going to solve this thing, and I'm going to go headlong into this thing. And he did about, I don't know, he did a number of those versions until he eventually came to question, why do I keep doing this thing over and over again? Why do I keep looking for some external system that's eventually going to bring relief to the suffering, and none of them ever do? And this was as you can imagine, this was kind of like a scary thought to really take in. It's a question like the whole train of how he was operating. And as he did, he came to what he understood to be a realization that I think is actually accurate, which is that he felt like there was this core knot, or this core curving in on itself, or whatever you want to say, contracting in on itself. And that none of those other teachings were ever dealing with that. they were just weren't aware of it, or skipping over it, or just like, don't worry about that. Let's all move ahead. Here's our practices, and then we'll go into these states, and then we'll realize these things, and then we're going to be okay. That altered state trajectory. And Augustine wondered, what if that whole thing is starting off on a flawed premise because it's not dealing with this fundamental knot in the core of my heart? And then, which I think was quite amazing and brave, actually.
For that time.
I think for any time.
For any time, yeah, I guess for any
but
time.
certainly then, but even still, I think is quite ahead of its time.
Yeah.
Even now.
Yeah.
Now, where he came to with it, and this is where I kind of part ways, with all due respect, the great St. Augustine, is he kind of felt like there was nothing that could be done about this knot. He got to a place where he became very pessimistic, that it was it's unfixable. There was nothing to do with it. So basically had a kind of a theological view that there was going to be an external deity, God presence that was going to come and just kind of take him out of this whole thing.
Right.
And that caused its own, that was kind of where he and I part ways. But I've always wondered, what if we bring somatic practice and the principles of resourcing and pendulation and titration and all those goodies. What if we brought that in curiosity to that knot? Or knotting, rather than starting off with all this, here's how I'm broken, here's the magical system that I need to go on a 28-year journey in order to become some enlightened being, and then I'll be fixed, and then I'll be okay. Augustine, I think, was on the right track, that he was actually saying, what if we actually just started practically and pragmatically with this more fundamental, what I think is kind of like an arch trauma, essentially.
Yeah.
What is the nature of that recoil in the face of life? It's that life feels too much or too fast. And what happens if, instead of starting with all these other practices as the place to begin, we might bring them in later? What if we started with, I can actually sense that core restlessness and core unease with life, and what could we do about that? And if that were to have some movement brought to it, or some acceptance, some grace, some resourcing, then what becomes available in our life? As really seemingly, it's kind of counterintuitive. It seems like, that would be the last thing ever to work on, because that feels like it's the deepest core thing or whatever. But I kind of wonder, maybe it's actually the place to kind of to be starting with and always coming back to.
I agree.
It's a thought, anyway.
It is a thought. How are we to give ourselves time or even work with this when our world around us, the society, doesn't even allow us time to do our daily needs of cleaning, cooking?
Right.
It must be so nice to have all that time,
right,
and to do these things.
I would say, and it's a totally fair, and I unfortunately don't have a magic wand to make an unjust world just. So part of the reality, unfortunately, is having to deal with how we're going to still have our individual paths while living in systemic injustice and chaos. That's part of the gig. Not everybody suffers the impacts of it to the same degrees. That's totally true. And we're all still in this thing. So even if it's 5 or 10 minutes, the thing about this practice that's interesting is there's no magic technologies needed. It's as mundane and as kind of day to day as it comes, actually. What's interesting, at least in my experience with working with this, has been as that, I don't think the game is ever to like get rid of the knot, just to be clear. I don't think that's like, again, I think that's would be the same old game of like, okay, and then I'll spend 30 years and then one day it'll be fully free and I'll be completely free and then I'll be, no.
Then I can breathe finally.
Yeah, no, this is part of the gig. This is part of the human thing. It can definitely like open and relax in certain ways and there can be more fluidity, but it's to some degree or another, I think, baked in. But what does open up as more, I think, love and attention is brought to this in a safe way, in my experience, a lot more pleasure and happiness in the best sense, joy. The technical term is bliss, but it's not like blissing out. It's just very day-to-day, like joy in existing, a natural simplicity. And the other thing is trust. To actually start trusting ourselves, to trust life, to learn who we can trust, maybe not trust as much in our lives. And so all those things that I think everybody wants in the altered state journey are all actually right there. We don't need to go on a 10,000 year journey up a mountain and to other dimensions or whatever. It's like, it's just right there in connection with and just on the other side of that knot. So it seems ironic to go on all these great heroic journeys elsewhere just to come back and realize that was Augustine's kind of classic insight. He had spent decades literally and figuratively traveling the world of his day looking for all these answers, and rather than just go, oh, whoops, I'm just going to have to face my own heart. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of the story of a lot of the fables, like Alchemist, for example. You know?
The prodigal son. Yeah.
So here's a devil's advocate piece. Is so, okay, that's nice, but that's just so boring, Chris. Like, I want the fireworks, and like we've been trained for novelty. And some of this basic work of titration, resourcing, it looks like paint drying, like you're watching paint dry. And it seems like we almost have to break, I don't know if that's the right word, but shift. It's that 180-degree thing again of, oh, really, you don't need to do that. You know?
Well, if you got to seek, you got to seek. Like that's the kind of, if a person's really gung-ho and emotionally attached, but they want those experiences, then go have them. And then I hate to tell you that they'll be wonderful and amazing, hopefully, if you have them. And then you'll also find, like Augustine said, they don't last. They're not permanent. Even in Buddhism, there's these strains of Buddhism that I love where they say, like, the realm of the gods is its own karmic realm. So these gods live for eons in pure pleasure and bliss, whatever. And even they eventually, according to that story, like that runs out. And then they're going to have to face like, their own existence in whatever realm. Like, I love that idea. It's a wild idea.
They leave that out often.
You go up to heaven and then it's all everlasting eternity, and it'll just be, angels and play harps and whatever. And, eventually someone's going to get bored of that. It could be so, if we're looking for an external state to make us feel okay, eventually that state is going to change. It's the weather, it's going to change. It's the only consistent or constant.
Yeah.
So eventually you're going to be left with here you are back in this moment. Maybe you've gone on some incredible journeys and had your mind blown and learned amazing things, and that'd be cool. And then you're still going to have like all these people who have the like memoirs of like, I had the mystical experience and my life was transformed. And then like 5 years later, they write the book of like, and then I also collapsed. And then and then it turned out that wasn't it. And I was wrong. And
Well, it makes me think of the past year with everything and not traveling. I was really thinking about this. I have not traveled. Like the last time I didn't go somewhere on a plane or on a trip or training, it would have been like, I would have been 22 maybe.
Wow.
You know, whether it was for a school thing, moving to Australia, going on a big adventure to Europe, there was always something. And I just think it's really interesting how the last year it was for me in my immediate world. We've really nested, we've really enjoyed being, you know, in a very mundane routine.
Yeah.
And I find myself like, oh, it's just so nice to.
Right.
And then it's like, really? Like maybe not, you know. And so it's been, you know, some have been itching to travel and get away, and maybe people are. And then there's some of our colleagues and friends where we're just kind of like, okay, I guess we're doing this, we're staying put, and we're not going anywhere, and we'll just work on our stuff.
Yeah.
So.
And if one does want the fireworks and stuff, just make sure you do it as best any of us can, because it just feels like a creative impulse, and it would be fun to have some fireworks. Fireworks they go off, they're pretty, and then the fireworks show's over. If you can enjoy that rather than like, oh, the fireworks are done now.
I want it again.
Like, yeah, wait till next year. No, it's like, if you want those kind of things, do it for the right reasons, I guess is all I'm trying to say.
So at the very top of our talk, you talked about building, you used the word iron steel. I wrote it down because I didn't want to lose that. In your work with your clients, I mean, you're very somatically based as well. What does that mean, developing this iron steel? Because that necessarily doesn't mean not with flow.
Right, not rigidity, but I think a fundamental trust and confidence in oneself that come hell or high water or both, I'll find my way through. That level of resolution or resolve in one's being, that I'll be true to myself, and I'll be generative and find some agile, creative response to whatever occurs. And, you know, to be human with yourself and be kind to yourself for the moments. We all have our moments of like, it's too much. I lost my center there for a couple of days. Hey, it happens to all of us. That's also part of it. But to be able to come back to a place and go like, I have, not from a vigilance response of like, I have to soldier on. It's gotta be, I gotta get through the grim, but like, no, like part of the mastery we spoke of earlier, the elegance of it is, I can bob and weave, I can improv. You know, like I remember this friend of mine who's an amazing chef, masterful. And like one night it was like, there was no dinner, and just like looked at all this like random weird stuff in the kitchen and was like, you know what? And then all of a sudden 20 minutes later, it was like, whoa, how did you do that? And how did you even have the capacity to see the possibilities that all I could see was just a bunch of random stuff that had no relationship to each other? That's the kind of master we're talking, kind of just at a human, like we're trying to master being human, not to be superhuman, not to be some other version that's sold, whatever it might be, but actually just be like really our divine human selves, and say like, okay, whatever comes up, we'll try to figure out a solution to this thing, a generative creative response, see where it goes. Because God knows there's no templates, you know, we're in uncharted waters at this point. So we're off the map.
You sure?
We're off the map. We totally are off the map. So we're off-roading. You know, like Tolkien, like a Tolkien map, like Lord of the Rings, where it's like, here's the dragons are up here, you know, it's like we're in the dragons, there's the dragons are around, like there be dragons here. So we might as well learn to trust our instincts and cultivate and hone our skills of resilience and our native intelligence, because there's no external script that we've all been that's prepared us for what we're in now and what's coming down the pike.
Do you believe that, there's that saying, it's already been writ?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you think about that?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
Because, and what primed me was when you said we're off-roading now. Because there's these lines of thought that parallel realities are occurring and we can change our timelines and all these
Sure.
things. And just,
Sure.
I mean, that might be a fun way to come to an end, because there can be this existential, there's no point, I can't control any of it. And then the other thought is, well, we can, by our actions, kind of that old adage. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of openness and possibility.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a future that wants to come into existence
Mm-hmm.
that is far more life-giving, that's far more harmonious, that's far more compassionate and just and right and thrilling and abundant. But I don't think it's predestined. I don't think it's just going to drop out of the sky or whatever one day.
Yeah.
Like, we're going to have to embody that energy to make it become real. But I do think like there is some, it's like when they talk about like, there's already all kinds of technological fixes to any of the various crises people tend to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the solution or the fix that we need. We need the fix of like becoming energetically congruent to the space of the solution. And then those things start to show up.
That's a great place to end. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.